I I get the privilege of introducing Sherrie. We reached out to her and asked her to participate instead of the normal CFP process because we've had Sherrie before, and I've known Sherrie for a while. And I will say, I don't want to take up too much time in your talk because it's one of the more important talks here, I think. But I do want to opine and fawn from a distance and say that I get to work and have worked with for years her husband, Sergio, and I used to think Sergio was a really, really smart person. And then I met Sherrie and I realized he's the idiot of the two. And Sherrie and her wonderful work at the Global Emancipation Network is just fantastic. Sergio turned me on to it years ago with a very sombering statistic when he said, Rob, there are more slaves in America today than there were before the Civil War. And that's really where I got to know Sherrie's work and all that she focuses on. And so, although it will be a fairly serious talk, I know Sherrie always has the levity to bring it well. And the work that she and her volunteer force do across the world doesn't get near enough attention or credit, but it's extraordinarily impactful. So, Sherrie, thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing once again your experiences, especially on how all this unfolded throughout a pandemic and what that really means for our broader community and kind of the tie-in to our InfoSec profession. So over to you, and thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been fantastic to get to know some of you in this community. And even though I usually feel like the interloper here in this group, I always appreciate the welcome that you give me. I am just going to take 1 minute here to share this deck with you. No, or maybe they're going to share it for me. Fantastic. Okay. This is a kind of funny title that I was hoping would just get you hooked here, but we're talking about a different kind of vulnerability than you usually are talking about in these kinds of conferences. The vulnerability that I want to mention today, as Rob was kind enough to say, is human trafficking and modern slavery. It is an evil that has plagued the world from the beginning of time. And as much as we and so many others are doing work to combat it, I suspect it will, because it really comes down to the human evils that are present. And just quick background on it, for those of you who aren't familiar with human trafficking, we currently estimate that there are between 25 and upward of like 45 million slaves in the world today. And that number should be completely shocking. It's almost so big that you can't really wrap your head around that number, right? That's equivalent at the top end to the entire population of Spain. So what I want to show you today, though, is more importantly, how is human trafficking and modern slavery impacted specifically by coronavirus? And I know that we're all sort of getting tired of talking about COVID-19 and what the impacts are, but there are things that you can be doing today to have an impact, particularly with your skills looking for advanced threats. So just from the very top here, it has been a massive problem across the board for human trafficking survivors, for current victims, for those working to combat. The top thing that I know has been being seen in the news here is benefits fraud that is related to unemployment insurance that lots of governments have offered around the world, including the United States. And this is really a continuation of the same sort of fraud that has been happening for years. Unfortunately, traffickers realize, of course, that human trafficking is a money-making business, and there are lots of ways that they can game the system. We have some interesting experience working cases that were only discovered through DMV sort of fraud that was related to some interesting things in the state of California, actually. And since then, we've really been digging into it. So in general, the trafficker basically has a set of human trafficking victims who are under their control, and they actually make them apply for benefits, sometimes under their own names, sometimes under a set of sort of owned personas. Sometimes they're completely legal documents. They're basically farmed out and rented out, and they receive these benefits. So that is one thing that really affects all of us from a bottom line right now. Obviously, then, as it has happened with so many of us, and I know that we're pretty lucky in this space, everyone has seen the economy shrink, right? There is obviously then even more of an instance of reduced economic access for human trafficking victims and for those who are most at risk to become victims. And so we're usually talking about Indigenous peoples, we're talking about minorities, the LGBTQ community, obviously refugees. So this already vulnerable population then, with the loss of jobs, and I'm going to show you some other things in just a little bit, have been suffering with reduced economic access that makes them even more likely to take the sketchiest of job advertisements that they see. Something that I know many of you have been noticing, and I have 4 kids of my own, there are 5 kids in my house. Kids are online all the time right now, right? Everyone is doing Zoom school. I know some are sort of back for some sort of in-person model right now, but the amount of time that children, particularly the young sort of preteen set, are spending online is more than ever before. We're seeing them become more and more tech savvy very, very quickly, and it doesn't stop at Zoom. It's sort of obviously in all the the personal computing devices, whether it's smartphones or iPads, Kindles, everything is affected. In this talk here, because I'm trying to scare you a little bit, but not too bad, I want to equip you with ways that you can protect your children against human trafficking as well. So I'm going to give you some advice on that. Interestingly enough, and there's sort of a debate between the human trafficking community and the sex work community between whether or not pornography is completely, obviously voluntary, or how much of it is sort of forced. In the first couple of weeks after the lockdown began in the United States, it began in California, right, and then Washington back in March. The number of users on Pornhub, it was up 400%. So the amount of exploitation and maybe boredom that results in it has been very, very notable. It's been interesting. And obviously there is some, consensual sort of content that is produced and shared on sites like that. And then there are some that isn't. And unfortunately, as the consumer of that sort of work, oftentimes you don't know the difference. The other thing that's important to note, I'm going to kind of lump these two things together, is that survivor access to support networks, whether those are federally funded services through Department of Homeland Security or Health and Human Services, or state and local, the equivalents abroad, or if it's through nonprofits like Global Emancipation Network or the more victim service oriented ones, has obviously shrunk drastically. The sort of perfect storm of the defunding police movement that sort of came about in the conversations with Black Lives Matter, and then obviously the coronavirus shrinking of budgets even further, has really interrupted funding streams for both law enforcement and for non-governmental organizations like us who are working to combat the problem. I can share basically between March and maybe even August, the conversations just completely stopped. Everyone said we have to be heads down on coronavirus. Unfortunately and obviously, human traffickers didn't stop their work during that time. So we know that we lost visibility, we lost access to potential ways of rescuing victims during that time. And then the other thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit more is that during normal times and normal staffing, there are some, investigations that take place that are really quite routine through monitoring of business licenses. You can think about it, nail salons, massage businesses and whatnot, that all have these periodic evaluations. Obviously, some of those sort of businesses have been under coronavirus restrictions, and not all of them obviously have been complying with them. But as a result of not having access to these businesses as they usually would have done, more and more of these businesses, and as a result, human trafficking victims, have been falling through the gaps. The other last thing on this slide I want to mention here is something that we all probably saw. I know that for us, it was really difficult to order on Amazon for a while. There were some things that we tried to get access to over the time, like so many of you, that suddenly, it was very long wait to get a hold of. I heard like refrigerators that you had to order out like 4 or 5 months at a time, right? As a result of these shortages that were happening from factory and whatnot, staffing measures to limit the spread of coronavirus, supply chains really shifted rapidly, much more so than in usual times. And as a result, there were some safeguarding checks that are usually in place that were waived during this time. Obviously, some of those needed to happen, and it was good for society, but there is always a risk that comes on the backside of that as well, and that labor trafficking far outweighs sex trafficking. globally. And that means that, when some of those safeguards fall down, more people fall prey. So this is something that I'm more leaving up here for you to review later after this talk. This is an analysis that Interpol did on the impacts, more specifically related to how strong the pandemic is happening and what do the restrictions look like for human trafficking. And it sort of breaks down as you would expect, obviously. The greater the restrictions are, the more acute the epidemic is, obviously the greater impact that there is on human trafficking victims. But there's some interesting things in here for you to review later that shows about routes, whether it is the sort of normal supply chain routes or movement of people, money and whatnot, and the way that those things change as a result of a pandemic. And I think that if you were to extrapolate this and provide it sort of out into other domains, you can see the way that supply chain shifts have an impact on human trafficking and other things that you wouldn't necessarily assume is the case. Here are some immediate effects that I wanted to share with you, and I've already mentioned one of them here. We know that there has been at least a 40% increase in urgent crisis cases that have come through the national trafficking hotline that's run by Polaris. That has been drastic, and we're talking about care that needs to happen within 24 hours. And that's double the number of emergency shelter requirements. And I know that we've all heard sort of the impact that coronavirus has had on domestic violence at large. And much the same way it has been affecting survivors and current victims there. When people are locked into their houses, obviously it means that they're there with everyone who usually lives in their house. And for these people, it often means they're abusers and they're traffickers. And the people who are maybe usually able to find an escape have an even smaller window of opportunity now. So not only obviously has those cases drastically increased, but the window of time that they have the ability to be saved or save themselves really has drastically shrunk. I already mentioned the Pornhub statistics here that are pretty shocking and a little funny, right? But as we mentioned, there's a consent issue here. And I bring this up to sort of segue into the next piece as we're talking a little bit more about our kids and how to keep them safe from predators online and human traffickers. And this is a number that really shocked me as a parent. My oldest daughter just turned 13 the other day, so it's even more relevant now that my kids are becoming teenagers, really, that 69% of child sexual abuse imagery is self-generated in the years between 11 and 13. So that means that no longer does someone actually have to be, say, kidnapping and controlling a victim live. They're actually telling them remotely. They have psychological control. Take this picture for me and upload it here. And sometimes the case is that it's actually just selfies that are nude and whatnot, and then it sort of turns into an abuse situation. So this is something that's really important to discuss with your children, obviously framing it in a more appropriate way, but it's important to notice here that the majority of child sexual abuse material is self-generated. And that takes us on to the next bit. I promised you some tips here, and many of these are just as relevant for keeping your children safe online in general. And there are a couple of fantastic organizations who really focus on this specifically. In particular, I want to give a shout out to Thorn, who some of you may know as the organization that Ashton Kutcher and Demi Moore started, that do fantastic work specifically around child sexual exploitation and exploitation of children online. So with that here, well, I told you that the usage for children online has gone up drastically, right? It's up at least 50% for children in the ages between 6 and 12. And we know that, as always, teenagers are spending lots of time online too, and that doesn't stop just with their Zoom classes. I would encourage you to learn about their favorite apps and pay attention to what their phones contain, what apps are on their phone. With that, make sure that you know all of their passwords. And I know it's really difficult as the kids get older and you're thinking about that trust relationship and privacy concerns. But it's really important because for two things, really. One is that some of the apps that are on a phone are actually masquerading as other sort of messaging apps. And there's a famous example that's a calculator, for example. So actually sort of play around on that phone. Make sure you know what those apps are and that they are what they look like they are as well. Use parental filters that are available, like Circle, which is what we use in our house, that allows you to limit access, requires permission to, install apps, for instance, things like that. And try to make it something that's a little bit less about monitoring their behavior, but a little bit more as something fun to do together. So an example for that is, some of you probably know the latest TikTok dances, for example, right? But do a challenge with them, involve them in it so that they can see the ways that technology can be used for good to bring people together and solve everyday problems. And it isn't something that you're doing as sort of an enemy, an adversary of theirs, right? And then I mentioned Thorn in particular, sextortion. This is really it's really specific to imagery, but then there's also texting, right? Or sexting, as it's usually called. And these are really shocking statistics. There was a study done in coordination with Thorn and another group that showed that 10% of children, by the time they're 8, have received inappropriate text or images. That's by the time they're 8. It's almost half by the time they're 14. So this is the environment in which they are sort of living online. I urge you to know the lingo, and we'll talk about a little bit more in some of the other projects that we're doing. But there is obviously a coded language and emojis and Unicode and GIFs and whatnot that sort of go along with this. Thorn and others have published some of theirs. I have a more extensive one. I think that depending on sort of what your needs are for it, I'm very happy to share with you. But make sure you know what sex language looks like, what grooming looks like online. And not just in these apps and these messaging protocols, some of which are obviously encrypted as well, but be aware of the online gaming conversations, both those that allow for voice conversations, for video chat, as well as text, as a lot of this sort of content and abuse is moving to online gaming environments. Video in general is drastically increasing as opposed to text environments as well. Then the last one, which really sort of sums this up and is about what we're talking about entirely, but foster that openness with your children. Be that safety net that they need, that, when things do go wrong, they feel like that they can turn to you. While you're doing that, because not all kids will feel confident going to their parents about these sorts of things, make sure that you're providing and teaching independent options for them. Know that if they're playing Roblox and someone is being a bully or they're inappropriately messaging in the app, what they themselves can do to block that person, to report them within the app. And that goes to my next one, is make sure that you and your children are reporting all offensive content, whether it is to the app, to Facebook or Instagram or Roblox or Xbox, but also if it is particularly child sexual abuse material, do not share that with anyone. Do not share that content with police. You actually have to do a direct report to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So let's now take the knowledge that we have about how dangerous this environment is for our children, and let's put an optimistic spin on it. I was lucky enough to share a peek about this project when I was presenting, at the end of 2019 here with SANS, and I'm really happy to come back and provide an update on this. This is my now 13-year-old girl who was at the time just 4 years old when we were living in the UK. And this was her school uniform there. And you can see what I have in the picture here is all of these little bits and bobs are labeled, what the color is, the pattern, what clothing type it is. And the reason for this is that in the UK, where this project is centered, there is a catalog of over 17 million child sexual abuse images and videos. And this goes along with what we were just talking about, right? And every month, there's 250,000 more added to that catalog. 250,000, right? So this is a rapidly expanding and ballooning animal. And they're realizing that the team doesn't have the tools that they need to adequately address them in a timely manner. And one of the things that they came to us and said, hey, we have this uniform culture. We know in this catalog of abuse imagery that some of them are still wearing their school uniforms. And that really speaks to the innocence, I think, and I know really affects me personally, and I'm sure it's hard to hear too. But at Global Emancipation Network, we said, let us help you. And we have been working on this custom image analysis tool that is called Crista, which is Latin for crest or badge. And it really provides a few different functions on it. There's two main interfaces, one for school administrators, and honestly, the public at large as well are able to provide images, both of the school uniforms and the crest and badges, then do some basic labeling so that it's not just us and our team of volunteers, as Rob was so kind of mentioned, labeling the data for 55,000 schools across the UK. And this is going to be voluntary at first, and then probably moving toward a mandatory participation as the annual safeguarding procedures. Then on the other side, for law enforcement and for the people in the CADE team, that's a child abuse image database team in the UK, to obviously query the data set and to receive feedback about, in the image, obviously their intent is to find who the child is as quickly as possible to put them in a safe position, right, to rescue them. And they need to figure out where that school is that uniform matches so that they can then identify the child, right? So we have a few different machine learning and AI algorithms that we have been able to string together to provide full host of functionality that we're really excited to roll out. I could use your help on this. So I mentioned that there's 55,000 schools. We currently have a data set that's over 100,000 images of these schools that I could use your help labeling to help keep all of our kids safe online. So I'll leave up my info later, and in the Slack hallway, please make sure you ping me if you're interested in helping out on this. Then the other thing that I wanted to make sure to talk about, and then we'll have time for questions and answers here, is something that I was privileged to share again a little bit about as we were beginning to scope the project. And it has since turned into a full product offering through Accenture, actually, who was the co-developer of this solution. The sad reality is that there are a large number of illicit massage businesses across the world. And I'm going to give you some data about this from the US, but I'll share other things that are from other countries. This is a worldwide problem and it operates very similarly. In the United States, the most recent data that we have from December suggests that there's just over 10,900 illicit massage businesses. And when I say illicit massage business, what I'm meaning is that they're selling sex. These are basically brothel fronts. And in the majority of these, there's an element of coercion and human trafficking. And obviously, there's sort of a scale here, right? But it's this very interesting intersection of labor trafficking and sex trafficking here. Now, I said that there's 10,914, right? That's actually 350 more businesses than were open, the illicit businesses, than were open in November. So we still have this environment where in many of the states, as we talked about in the beginning, coronavirus restrictions have actually closed these businesses, or so we think so, but we still have a non-compliance issue. And the way that these businesses usually operate is that they are part of a triangle, if you will. So up at the top will be these storefronts like you see here, that many of you may even be familiar with in your hometowns that have, they're usually in a strip mall. They're usually, have their windows all covered. They have, interesting posters. Maybe there's a security camera right out front, or a door from a back alley. They're pretty easy to see, except in some instances where it's really difficult and interesting to assess. That's the part one, the one at the top of the triangle. The other piece that's owned by the same organizations is usually a apartment brothel and a hotel brothel. And during the beginning of coronavirus, what we actually saw was that the storefronts were closing for the most part, but the same people were being moved in either the apartment or the hotel brothels. As hotel restrictions tightened as well, we saw most of it move to apartments. But then we also were able to use some really interesting data sets, and I'll show you some of those in just a minute, to figure out that, obviously they weren't really compliant with coronavirus restrictions. Of course, they're not really compliant with business licensing restrictions either, so we shouldn't be surprised, but it does provide a unique opportunity through coronavirus restrictions and sort of enforcement to get an eye in on these businesses and have a reason to conduct an investigation. This is a map that I wanted to show you that one of the doctoral students that has been so kind to work with us on this, her name is Margaret Toby, just a fantastic person and a really smart individual, put together of some analysis that we were doing specifically in the area of Miami. And I'm showing you this not because heat maps are particularly amazing, but just when you're talking about data at scale like this, and it's maybe not the same thing as logs and the data that you're usually mining through, but obviously 10,900 businesses that we know are illicit is a very large number. It's way too many to go through manually. And we know that there are hundreds of thousands of massage businesses in general across the US, let alone the world. We have to figure out ways to triage. We have to find the worst offenders. And the tools that we have available at our disposal, including GIS and visual spatial sort of analysis, including network tools, help us to hone in on those. So what I want to show you here is, yes, this is a heat map. On the right side, you have legitimate businesses in the Miami area. On the left side, you have the illicit massage businesses. We call them IMBs. And you can see some interesting trends here, including that they aren't in the downtown sector, for instance, right? They're on these suburbs. They tend to be in the south side of Miami, where you can see on the right side, the legitimate businesses are pretty evenly distributed with more concentrated in the town center. So when you delve into something like this, then the question is why? And I'm lucky enough to be the national policy lead in the US on illicit massage businesses. It's a really niche field, obviously, but these are the questions that we are able to provide data for that really inform the day-to-day. And another example of this, obviously, is that there are different zoning requirements in each of these that really provide civil and regulatory control over human trafficking in our own backyards. That some of these jurisdictions, for instance, have restrictions on landlords of these strip malls and other places that basically allow the other tenants in the space to vacate without any sort of compensation for the landlord if there is an IMB found in the same plaza. So it sort of puts the financial onus back on the landlords and on insurers as well, in order to eliminate these places. But seeing it visually like this, using tools like GIS, enables us to see and really hone in and ask the right kinds of questions for our analysis. And then I promised you some interesting data and techniques. And I know that my field in particular is human trafficking, but I would urge you to think like we do and find some creative ways to use data. And just really quickly, I'll leave this up here. Again, you'll have it in the chat. But there are some really interesting things that we do, particularly around image analysis. And, for you might be able to find a vendor to be able to, pick up a IOC feed, for example. That doesn't exist for human trafficking. So we always have to get really creative with the data sources. They're usually messy and really ugly and not at all meant for our use case, but it makes it so that we're more agile. And I urge you to think that way too. Think about what the problem is that you're trying to solve. In our case, is there an IMB here? Are they there at the wrong hours that would make sense for a legitimate business? Where are the businesses located and what sort of zoning regulation, right? And this is a whole suite of them. We have found foot traffic monitoring tools, particularly those that have been available free of charge during coronavirus, to be really useful. SafeGraph is a great example of that. From businesses as well. And I'll tell you about one more in just a minute here, that we have been able to pull up really messy and lengthy, sort of manually processed data sets that have been of great value to us, whether it's farm labor, contracting blacklists, arrest records, media articles. A quick shout out to Traffic Analysis Hub in particular, which is sort of built on IBM Watson, to really pin on or zone in on the people, both the traffickers and the victims and businesses, as well as sort of online content, reviews and advertisements that really make it possible to be a threat hunter in the human trafficking domain. So I want to make sure to leave a couple of minutes for questions here. What's happening next for Global Emancipation Network? We are so excited to be releasing a podcast this year. And we've been able to secure some really fantastic folks for it, including Her Royal Highness Princess Eugenie from the UK to be on it, and some other fantastic headliners that I know you won't want to miss. Sign up for our newsletter so that you are one of the first to know when we do launch. Crista, the school uniform tool that I mentioned here, will be rolling out. We actually have a initial test for our tool set, gosh, in only 4 days, no pressure, right? With the child abuse image database team in the UK. The other one that just briefly I'll mention here is a tool that's being called Patch, Protect All the Children, that we're developing in coordination with Compassion International to really solve some really sticky problems. Obviously, the primary use case here is actually child abuse and grooming within this sort of relationship between sponsors and sponsors' children, but also has some really cool tech challenges like handwritten letters that are in other languages, for example, that we need to translate in order to set grooming and age sort of related classifiers on top of it. Would love any help on that as well. We are also really blessed to have a lot of student involvement across the US in this, whether it's University of Portland, North Carolina State University, Cal Poly, and many others. But we would love to be able to get more in the hands of this group. And because so many of the students that we work with are actually statisticians or computer science majors, I would encourage you to think about in your own field how you can mentor some of these leaders of tomorrow, and not just college students, but even a little bit younger than that as well. They're so hungry. They're still able to be, melded and shaped into using their skills for good. And then I already mentioned one of the volunteer opportunities, just some hands-on quick turnaround for some labeling tools that I would love your help on. Here is my email address, and please feel free to contact me, meet me in the hallway on Slack. And with that, I'll open it up to a few questions.